Hi, I'm Dave Hilowitz. So last week we talked a little bit about the basics of Kontakt scripting. This week I thought it might be useful to cover how I go about actually recording samples and chopping them up and getting them ready for Kontakt. To that end, I thought we would sample this instrument, which is a sort of a Kalimba thumb piano thing. It's been made out of a gourd. The tines are on backwards. It sounds okay. I'm hoping that after some cleanup, it'll actually sound really good as a sampled instrument. So let's get started. Okay, so I've got my mic set up. A couple things about these. These are pretty basic mics. This is a Samson, this is an Octava. You don't really need very, very fancy mics. They just have to be condenser mics. You'll also notice that I'm using Reaper to record my samples. It's by far my favorite software for recording, and you'll see why in a sec. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit each of these notes 5 times. I want there to be round robins, of course. I don't really care about velocity layers. I don't think that this instrument sounds that different when I hit it hard versus when I hit it softly. Okay, let's get started. Okay, I think that's what's wonderful about this instrument. It just doesn't have that many notes to sample. Okay, let's edit. Okay, so we've recorded all our samples. Now it's time to edit. So I'm gonna go into Reaper. By the way, if you think that recording samples is boring, editing samples is like 10,000 times worse. It's just so tedious. You just have to remember, this is a means to an end. At the end of this, we're gonna have a beautiful, playable instrument, and it's totally worth it. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do in Reaper is I'm actually going to export out these tracks. You see I've taken a little bit of silence and put it in its own little segment over here. I'll explain why that is in a little second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this entire chunk and I'm going to export it out. Okay, so now for the time being, I'm done with Reaper. I'm going to close out of Reaper, and we're going to come back into it in just a second. And now I'm going to move over to RX Elements. If you haven't used RX before, it's this really good noise reduction plugin that's now actually been turned into a standalone piece of software. So I'm going to pull those 2 mic tracks in. Okay, and now we're going to do some noise reduction. The way that the noise reduction works is you have to teach RX what silence sounds like, because when you say silence, you're not really talking about silence. You're talking about like this weird hiss that's caused by, the crummy mic I use, the crummy cable I use, the crummy preamps. Everything introduces a little bit of hiss, and every signal is going to have a slightly different sounding hiss. So what we're going to do is we're going to select that little bit of silence that I isolated towards the end, and we're going to select it. And we're going to say, learn. It's called voice denoise, but it actually works on music too. So we do learn, and now we go back to our entire file, and we open up the voice denoise plugin. Okay, so I'm gonna put on headphones. Here's what it sounds like turned off. And now turned on. Okay, I've been pretty brutal. This is a really kind of soft recording that I've done here, and I kind of don't care that much if there are some artifacts that are introduced. That'll be part of the charm of the instrument, I guess. So I'm processing it, and then I'm going to do the exact same thing for the other mic track. Okay, I'm back in Reaper. Now I'm going to take those 2 tracks I just did noise reduction on, and I'm going to drag them in, and we're going to put them on separate tracks. And I'm going to do something that Reaper's really good at, which is grouping clips. If you group clips, which you do with the context menu and group items, you can just hit G. Basically, anything that you do to one clip will be done to both clips. So it's really useful for when you have 2 mics, or if you're editing drum tracks and you have like 8 mics, it's really, really helpful for that. Next, I'm going to show you probably the most useful feature in all of Reaper for me, which is the find next transient function. So I can just hit tab, and look, it jumped right to the start of that kalimba hit. So I hit S, splits the audio file, hit tab. And basically, I'm just going to do this the entire length of the file. Okay. Okay, so now what I've got is a bunch of clips, and each one of them contains the kalimba hit that corresponds to a specific note. And remember, I sampled every note 4 or 5 times. So we've just got these kalimba hits, and they're chopped right at the beginning. And we don't want them to actually be chopped right at the beginning, because we actually want to be able to kind of adjust the start times a little bit. So what we're going to do is first I'm going to shorten each one of these. And if you have everything grouped like this, you can just kind of drag the end, and it drags the end of all of them, which is really, really nice. It saves so much effort. And we're going to drag the beginning too. And then there's a cool thing with mouse modifiers, and I'm going to go into settings. And if you go down to mouse modifiers, okay, you see how it says if you hold down shift, it will move edge ignoring snap. I don't exactly know what that means, but I do know that if you double click on this and you go down to move edge and you make sure that relative edge edit is selected. And this is like a bunch of commands that I don't fully understand, but I do understand their effects. If you have that enabled and then you go up here and you hold down shift, you can actually change the envelope for all of the clips. And that means you can make a nice fade out, which is usually what you want on an instrument like this, on all of your clips. So we've split everything apart. Now all we need to do is kind of name them in a logical fashion so that we can import them into Kontakt. Okay, so what I want to do, because one of the best features about Reaper is that you can export out files based on region markers. What I want to do is I want to create region markers for every single one of these clips. So Reaper has a ton of functionality that's not actually available through the regular menus, and it's available only through this thing called the action list. So we go here and we type insert region, and you see you've got all of these functions that just have to do with creating regions. What we want is this last one, insert separate regions for each selected item. This will effectively make regions for each of our kalimba hits. So we hit run. And there we go. We've got a region for every single one of our hits. Now, if we go to the region list, or I guess it's called the region manager, we can see all of our notes. And I'm going to hit one. Okay, so the next thing to do is to name these, because otherwise it's going to actually export them out with these names. So I need to figure out what note each of these corresponds to, and that is by far the most tedious aspect of this entire project. So what I've done is I've pulled up Kontakt, and I've pulled up a random instrument, the SD reed organ, because it's the first one in my list here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to listen to each one of these kalimba samples. Okay, that's a D. And it's a D3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this D3 1. And we know the next one is going to be the same note. We'll call this D3 2. Still the same note, D3 3. And I'm going to do this for the entire list. Okay, I'm not going to make you watch this. I'm actually going to stop the camera and we can pick up when I'm done. Okay, so I finally tagged all of these with their note names, and I'm finally ready to export it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this cool feature that Reaper has called the render matrix. And as you can see, it has a list, a sideways list, of all of the regions that I made in my file. And I can choose to render out some or all of those regions. I'm going to render out all of the mic 1 tracks, except it turns out that 2 of the tines on my kalimba have the same note value. I don't need 9 different D# 3s, so I'm actually not going to export some of those out. Okay, so I've selected all the regions I want to render, and I'm going to hit render. Another cool feature of Reaper is that I can actually choose how I want to name my files based both on the region names and on the track names and on the file name and pretty much any other aspect of my project. So I'm going to export these out 4824. So I'm actually lowering the bit rate because 96 is kind of overkill for a sample. And I'm going to name it so that the track is a folder. So if we look here, it says master, and one of them is going to be master, which is the entire mix. And one of them is going to be mic 1, and one of them is going to be mic 2. You can actually see the name of the file it's going to give here, mic 1, mic 2, kalimba D3, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so the reason I'm doing that is it's much easier to drag things into Kontakt if you've put it into little subfolders like that. Okay, I'm going to hit render. So we can just kind of sit back and let it do its thing. Okay, we're done with that. Okay, so some time has passed and now I'm ready to map my samples. So I've got Ableton here and I'm gonna pull up Kontakt. You'll notice I'm using an older version of Kontakt. That's because I want my instrument to be compatible with a large range of Kontakt versions. If I make a sample in Kontakt 6, for example, nobody who has Kontakt 5 will be able to open my instrument. So I'm making it in 5.3, which is the oldest version of Kontakt that I own. Okay, so I'm gonna make a new instrument, of course, and I'm gonna open it up and I'm gonna open up the mapping and we're gonna browse to our directory where we have our samples. Okay, so here are my samples. If you'll remember, I recorded each note 5 times. So we've got a bunch of notes that have underscore and then a number. _1 is the first hit, _2 is the second hit, etc. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make 4 groups. I'm not gonna actually make 5, even though I recorded 5, because I wanna be able to throw one of the samples out. Like whatever the worst sample is, I'm gonna throw that out. So I'm gonna take this group and I'm gonna duplicate it 3 times. Now, why didn't I just hit create empty group? Because for some reason, when you hit create empty group, it uses actually different settings than the default group that comes with each new instrument. I know that's weird, but I find that if I hit duplicate group, for some reason it works better. Rename them 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so I've got my 4 groups. I think we're ready to import some samples. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab every sample that ends in _1 and I'm gonna drag it into that first group. You'll notice that I unclicked edit all groups because I actually only wanna edit the first group. And also I'm going to click this button here which says selected groups only. Okay, there are all my _1 samples. I'm gonna drag them in. And now I'm gonna do the same thing for the other 3 groups. I'm gonna speed this up so you don't have to watch this in real time. Okay, so now I've dragged into each group, I've dragged the samples that correspond to that group. I've dragged them into totally random spots right now. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm actually going to use the auto map to put them in the correct spot. So I don't really care about where they're mapped right now. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off selected groups only so that I'm actually editing all of the groups at the same time. So you can see there's a bunch of overlay there. I didn't actually map them to the same part of the keyboard even. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of my samples. And actually a safer way of doing that is to actually just do select all zones. And I'm going to right click and I'm going to open up AutoMap. What AutoMap does is it takes little bits of the file name and uses them to determine where the samples should be mapped. So Kalimba, the first part, is just a name. It's actually not useful information other than, for the human who's doing the programming. The second part is the useful information, and that is the actual key that we want this mapped to. So what we're going to do is set to single key. We're not going to do set sample root. And I'm going to hit apply, hit close. So what's happened here is that each one of these zones has been moved to the correct location on the keyboard. But there's a weird thing. If I select one of these, you'll notice, okay, this is sample A#4. The key range is A#4 to A#4, just like you'd want it. But the root node is wrong. That's just a weird thing about the way this auto mapping process works. So what we need to do is we need to change that root key to be correct. Luckily, we don't have to do that by hand. So again, I'm going to select all zones, and then I'm going to go to Batch Tools and move root keys to center. And what this is doing is this is actually setting the root key based on that key range. If we had a whole range of keys selected, like let's say C3 to C4, it would choose the middle point. Since we've just got one key selected, the middle point is the key itself. So if we check here, now A#4, and same thing here, this is D#4 and root is D#4. So great, we've now got the things mapped, and if I hit a key, hopefully it'll make a sound. Great. Of course, you can see there are gaps here. We don't actually have notes for all of these keys. So what we want to do is we want to actually have Kontakt fill in those gaps. So again, we do select all zones, and we right click, and we go to AutoMap functions, and we do auto spread key ranges via root keys. Since we've set our root keys now, we can do this safely. Great. Now I'm going to turn on selected groups only because it's kind of hard to do any work when we're actually editing 4 groups at once. So we're looking at group 1, we back out, and we'll notice that the key range is actually much, much broader than we would want it to be. I mean, that sounds kind of cool, but it's not very realistic. So we're actually going to restrict it to, let's say, C3 to C5. And I'm going to do that for all 4 groups. And you may have noticed when I did that, there's actually a gap here. For some reason, group 3 seems to be missing a sample. I think the sample we're looking for is A#3_3. So we're going to go here, and actually it's right there. I'm going to pull it in, and we're going to make sure that we set it to A#3, and I'm going to drag it to the left. Okay. So great, our samples are all mapped, they're exactly where they should be. What happens though if I hit a key? Okay, so there's a weird thing about this, which is that maybe you couldn't detect that, but I certainly felt it when I played it. When I hit this note, there's a delay between when I hit the key and when it actually sounds out. So you might remember when I was editing, I didn't actually chop these samples right on the hit. I chopped these samples with a little gap in front of each of them. So now what I want to do is I want to set the start time for all of the samples. Since I did it by the same amount for all of the samples, I can just set it once and then propagate that to all of the samples. So let us turn off selected groups and select all zones again. And we're going to open up the wave editor. I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to just drag this here. Okay, so right now I'm just editing Kalimba G#3_1. But what I can do is I can click on this little cog wheel, and then to all selected zones, copy current sample start setting. And just like that, the sample start has been set for every single sample that I'm using in the entire instrument. Okay, can turn selected groups back on. And if I look at any of these, you see how the sample start is the same. It always starts right when the hit starts. Okay, so now I'm going to play with it a little bit. Okay, so there are a couple things about this. First, it's horribly out of tune, so we'll deal with that in a second. But the other thing is that if you'll notice up here where the groups are, whenever I hit a note, it's actually using all 4 groups at the same time. Of course, we're trying to do round robins. So I'm actually going to turn that on right now. I'm going to do edit all groups, and I'm going to set them all to cycle round robin. Now, I'm not a big fan of traditional round robins. I actually have a whole other video about that. But for the purposes of building a sample, it's very, very useful to have a consistent rhythm because you can easily hear that there are defects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on round robin for all of these samples, and then I'm going to turn off edit all groups, and I'm going to set a position in the round robin chain for each of them. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make a little loop that just hits the same note over and over again. And because I've chosen to do round robins like this, I can actually hear that there are subtle differences. Like, for example, one of those is a little bit louder. Actually, what I think it is number 2 is a little bit soft. So I'm going to boost that by 3. Okay, that sounds pretty even. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop a tuner into my chain down here. Okay, so we can see from the tuner that this sample is actually sharp by about 40 cents. So what we're going to do is grab all 4 samples. Okay. Okay, so you get the idea. Basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through every single one of these samples, and I'm going to make sure that all 4 of them are the same volume and all 4 of them are the same pitch. It's incredibly tedious work to do this. You just have to keep reminding yourself that at the end, you'll have an amazing new instrument and you're going to make lots of great music, and you'll totally have forgotten about all of the labor that you put into it. Okay, so I'm going to cut now because it's just brutal to watch somebody do this. So I've gone through each of the zones, I've tuned it. Some of them have had their volumes boosted, some of them have had their volumes lowered. It was pretty tedious, but it wasn't that tedious because I don't have that many notes on this thing. So if you're doing a piano sample that has 88 keys and then you have multiple velocity layers, it's pretty brutal to do this kind of work. Okay, so we've got the sample and it sounds pretty good. But there's a weird thing about it, which is that when I hit a key and let go, it dies down immediately. Now, look what happens when I actually hit the kalimba. It takes about 3 seconds to die down. So I want to set an envelope that's about 3 seconds. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to each of the groups and I'm going to go down to the ADSR section and I'm just going to type in 3000 for 3 seconds. And I'm going to do that for all 4 of these. Okay, now when I hit a key, perfect. Okay, I think that's it. Time to make some music. So yeah, that's what I came up with. I'm going to put a link to this instrument in the description to this YouTube video so that you can download it and make music that probably sounds nothing like that. If you've been enjoying these videos, it'd be great if you'd hit the little subscribe button. Yeah, see you next time.